The room went dead silent when she questioned the order. That wasn't supposed to happen at Mercy General. Dr. Hargrove didn't get questioned. Not by nurses. Not by anyone with less than 3 letters behind their name and a trust fund that traced back to Connecticut shipping magnates. But there Sarah Chen stood at 2:48 a.m. in the ICU, holding a chart with a Navy SEAL's blood type circled in red, her voice steady as a surgical laser when she said, "We can't wait until morning, doctor." He hadn't noticed her until that moment. That was the problem. Sarah had been moving through the night shift at Mercy General for 8 months with the invisible efficiency of someone trying very hard not to exist. She arrived 45 minutes before her 11 p.m. start time, clocked in without speaking to anyone, and moved through the fluorescent-lit corridors of the ICU like a ghost with a stethoscope. Her scrubs hung loose, deliberately loose, to hide the network of scars that mapped her forearms like topographic lines on a battlefield. She wore her dark hair pulled back so tight it made her temples ache, specifically to cover the burn mark behind her left ear, the one she'd stopped trying to explain away years ago. Keep your head down. Do your job. Disappear at the end of your shift. That was the routine. That was survival. The night shift suited her. Fewer administrators. Fewer questions. Fewer people willing to look directly at someone who moved with the kind of precision that didn't match the job title on her badge. Most nurses worked in a sort of organized chaos, efficient, sure, but human. There was wasted motion. There were moments of hesitation. Sarah's hands didn't hesitate. When she drew blood, the needle went in on the first try. When she placed an IV line in a patient with collapsed veins, she found the vessel without searching. When she moved through a room, nothing was out of place when she left. The senior nurses had stopped asking how she'd learned to suture wounds that wandered into the civilian side of the ICU. The newer nurses stayed away from her during breaks. Dr. Hargrove, the cardiac surgeon who controlled the unit like a fiefdom and treated his staff like subordinates who should be grateful for employment, had never really looked at her at all. Until the trauma alert came through at 2:14 a.m. The intercom crackled with the kind of urgency that made everyone move faster. Trauma alert, Bay 4. Incoming SEAL team training accident. 14 minutes out. Sarah's body had reacted before her brain caught up, muscle memory from another life, another hospital, another version of herself that didn't exist anymore. She was moving toward Bay 4 before the overhead announcement finished. Her hands were already pulling supplies. 14-gauge angiocath needles. 2 units of O-negative on standby. The monitor was live, the crash cart accessible, 2 nurses already assembling equipment. This was the part of night shift that made the monotony worthwhile. This was the only time Sarah felt fully awake. The patient arrived 8 minutes later on a stretcher that screamed urgency. Navy SEAL Lieutenant James Morrison, 28 years old, unconscious from a training accident at nearby Naval Base San Diego. Internal bleeding suspected. BP already dropping, 89/56 and falling. The kind of numbers that meant minutes mattered. Dr. Hargrove arrived in his monogrammed dress shirt. Somehow the man was never truly asleep, never truly off duty, and he took over the moment his leather shoes hit the bay floor. His presence made the air pressure change, not in the way a true leader's presence does, but in the way a predator's does. The kind that made people smaller around him without him saying anything at all. He was tall, silver-haired at 54, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and a smile that had convinced a hospital board to pay him $847,000 a year to run a department where he was simultaneously the most brilliant surgeon and the most despised person in the room. Type and cross, he ordered without looking at anyone in particular. Already running, Doctor, Sarah said quietly, moving with Morrison's chart. O-negative is ready. His chart shows AB negative. We have 2 units coming from blood bank. I didn't ask for a committee meeting, Chen. I asked for a type and cross. Hargrove didn't look at her when he spoke. He was staring at Morrison's barely conscious face, already making calculations. The labs this morning will tell us what he actually needs. No point wasting product on guesswork. Sarah's hand stilled on the IV pump. Around her, the other nurses exchanged the kind of glances that meant everyone heard what he'd said, and everyone understood what it meant. Morrison's blood pressure was already dropping. The internal bleeding was already happening. Waiting for morning labs meant waiting 8 to 10 hours while a Navy SEAL with a catastrophic hemorrhage got progressively weaker, progressively colder, progressively closer to a point where no amount of transfused blood would save him. She should have stayed quiet. That was the pattern. That was the way to keep your head down at Mercy General. But something in her chest, the part that hadn't learned to shut up, the part that had carried 3 wounded sailors 2 miles through hostile territory in Ramadi just to keep them alive, made her speak anyway. His pressure's dropping below 80, doctor. Blood loss at this rate, we have maybe 4 hours before. I'm familiar with the physiology of hemorrhagic shock, Nurse Chen. Now he looked at her. His eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, and they held absolutely nothing resembling warmth. I'm also familiar with the fact that you work night shift because apparently no one else will hire you permanently. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to let nature take its course with the labs. We're going to monitor his pressure. And you're going to do exactly what I tell you to do. When I tell you to do it. Clear? Yes, doctor, Sarah said. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that comes from having already survived the worst that the world could offer, and knowing that if she let it out, if she let even a fraction of what she actually was show through the surface, this man would spend the next 6 months trying to destroy her. She was wrong about the timeline. It took him exactly 3 hours. Hargrove stayed in the unit, which was unusual. Normally he made his rounds and disappeared back to his office or home, leaving the night shift to handle the actual nursing. But with Morrison, with a Navy SEAL, with a high-profile patient, with someone whose unconscious body represented the kind of liability that hospital administrators got nervous about, he decided to camp out. He pulled a chair into Morrison's room. He ordered coffee. He reviewed labs that wouldn't be ready for hours. He was waiting for morning with the kind of patient vindication that only comes when you know you're going to be right and someone else is going to be wrong. What he didn't expect was for Morrison's commanding officer to arrive at 4:43 a.m. The man was a full commander, which meant he outranked everyone in the hospital except possibly the hospital administrator, and he moved through the ICU with the kind of authority that made even Dr. Hargrove stand up straighter. He was flanked by 2 other SEALs, both of them with the same predatory stillness, the same flat eyes. They didn't speak. They just watched. They watched as the commander read Morrison's chart. They watched as his jaw went tight, tighter, until the muscles clenched and released and clenched again. "Doctor," the commander said, and his voice was quiet in a way that made Sarah's nervous system recognize a threat. "Walk me through the treatment plan." Hargrove actually smiled. He explained the delay in transfusion. He explained the morning labs. He explained the value of avoiding unnecessary blood product waste. He explained it all in the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone too junior to understand complexity. Sarah was charting at the desk outside Morrison's room, close enough to hear every word. That was when Hargrove noticed her and made his first real mistake. "Nurse Chen," he called out, his voice carrying the kind of false pleasantness that made her chest tighten. "Come here, please." She came. Of course she came. She was a nurse, which meant she was used to being summoned by doctors the way dogs are used to being called. She kept her eyes down, kept her posture deferential, kept herself small in a way that felt so natural it was almost comfortable. Almost. "The commanding officer here is wondering about your suggestion to transfuse early," Hargrove said, gesturing at her the way someone might gesture at an exhibit. "Why don't you explain your reasoning? In medical terms, if you can manage it." The commander's eyes moved to her face. Both SEALs turned toward her like predators tracking movement. Sarah could feel all 3 of them assessing her, calculating her, deciding what kind of person she was based on the way she held herself and the way she answered. She kept her voice steady. Quiet. Professional. "Lieutenant Morrison's BP is already below 80. Continued blood loss at the observed rate suggests acute hemorrhage we haven't yet located. The 8 to 10 hour wait for morning labs. She paused. She should have stopped there. She should have let Hargrove have the last word and then disappeared. But she kept going, because some part of her that she'd tried to bury in the San Diego civilian world still hadn't learned how to not be who she actually was. Suggests we're waiting too long. I'd recommend AB negative transfusion initiation now. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Hargrove's smile didn't waver, but his jaw tightened. The commander's eyes narrowed. The two SEALs exchanged the briefest of glances, the kind that soldiers exchange when they recognize someone who's actually seen something. Really seen something. I appreciate the input, Nurse Chen, Hargrove said, and every syllable was coated in a kind of poisonous politeness. But I'm going to assume you understand the chain of command here. Doctors make treatment decisions. Nurses implement them. Not the other way around. Of course, Doctor, Sarah said, and she stepped back, her eyes down again, her shoulders small again, her entire presence collapsing back into the carefully constructed invisibility that had kept her safe for 8 months. But the commander was still watching her. And the SEALs were still watching her. And something had just shifted in the room, something Hargrove hadn't noticed because he was too busy congratulating himself on establishing dominance over a woman who'd never challenged him in her life. She stood at the desk and charted Morrison's vitals. She noted the continued pressure drop. She monitored the 4 lines. She moved through the next 3 hours with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and she waited for morning labs that both she and everyone else in that room already knew would confirm exactly what she'd said. But Hargrove wasn't finished. He was only getting started. And by 6:33 a.m., when morning rounds began and he positioned himself in front of his captive audience of residents, attending physicians, medical students, and nursing staff, he had already decided how the rest of Sarah's day was going to go. The rounds began normally. He was brilliant during rounds. That was the thing about Hargrove that made him so dangerous. He actually was a phenomenal cardiac surgeon. His diagnostic instincts were sharp. His treatment decisions were usually right. It was only when someone questioned him, only when someone suggested an alternative, that the other side came out. The side that needed to establish absolute dominance. The side that treated challenges like personal attacks. When they got to Morrison's room, Hargrove took his time. He let everyone know that he'd made the decision to wait for labs. He let everyone know that he'd been in the ICU all night making that decision. He let everyone know that there had been a suggestion, a mere suggestion, really, a question raised by someone with significantly less training, but that he had of course overridden it because that's what doctors do. And then he looked directly at Sarah, and he smiled, and he said the words that would start a cascade of events none of them could have predicted. Some people think experience comes from reading textbooks. I assure you, it comes from making the hard decisions. The right decisions. Even when everyone around you is questioning your judgment. The commander stepped forward. The 2 SEALs straightened. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, something dangerous and ancient, something she'd spent 8 months trying to keep locked down. She met Hargrove's eyes for the first time. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. And when she spoke, her voice had dropped half an octave, carrying with it the weight of something he didn't understand and would never survive. You should check his blood type again, Doctor. The room went absolutely still. The threat landed like a scalpel, precise and clean. Your license is on thin ice, Nurse Chen, Hargrove said during morning rounds, his voice carrying that particular cadence he used when teaching residents, the tone of a man correcting an inferior. They stood in the SEALs' room. 3 of them. The patient's commanding officer occupied the corner like a stone monument, arms crossed, jaw locked. 2 additional team members flanked the bed, their presence transforming the ICU room into something closer to a tribunal. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, indifferent to the tension that had just crystallized in the air. Sarah kept her eyes forward. She took one measured breath, the kind she'd learned to take in rooms that smelled of diesel exhaust and copper. The patient's pressures were trending downward at 2,300 hours, Doctor. I was concerned about. Hargrove cut her off with the efficiency of someone used to dominating conversations. Concerned. That's touching. But see, gentlemen, Nurse Chen here believes she knows better than a cardiac surgeon with 20 years of experience. He gestured toward her like she was a teaching exhibit. His fingers caught the fluorescent light, his wedding band catching and reflecting. I apologize for the unauthorized contact. Sometimes our less experienced staff get overzealous. The word landed with the weight he'd calculated. Overzealous. Like she was a golden retriever who'd gotten loose. The SEAL team members said nothing. Their silence was a different language entirely, one Sarah understood better than English. The commander's eyes were granite. She felt them on her like weight. A single tear escaped before she could stop it, rolling down her cheek in the clinical light. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove, and what he saw in that moment made his jaw tighten. Not fear. Not shame. Just a person watching him with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse things than his opinion. You should check his blood type again, doctor, she said quietly. Her voice had dropped half an octave. The type and screen was run at 01 for 7 hours. I'd verify it before initiating any transfusion protocol. Hargrove's face went rigid. He'd checked the blood type. Of course he'd checked the blood type. He was many things: arrogant, political, a man who built his career on the backs of people he could control, but he wasn't careless about fundamentals. But the way she'd said it, the absolute certainty in her voice, made doubt bloom like a toxin in his chest. He turned back to the patient's chart without responding, and that silence, that brief pocket of uncertainty, told her something crucial: she'd planted the seed. But that wasn't the worst part of what was coming. That afternoon, Sarah entered the staff break room with a container of rice and grilled chicken her mother had prepared, protein and discipline, the way she'd been taught to fuel. The conversation stopped. All three nurses turned to each other, eyes making quick decisions, and within 20 seconds the room was empty except for her. A respiratory therapist she'd worked side by side with for 6 months on 17 late-shift emergencies wouldn't meet her eyes as he gathered his coffee cup. She sat alone at a table built for 8, the fluorescent lights buzzing their mechanical dirge overhead. Rubber gloves snapped somewhere down the hallway, muffled voices resumed in the corridor just outside the break room door, and Sarah ate in measured bites, chewing 30 times before swallowing the way her drill instructor had taught her, present moment discipline even in small spaces. By evening rounds, Hargrove had completed his work. He posted the formal incident report on the unit board during shift change when maximum staff would see it. The letters were printed in bold: insubordination, protocol violations, Nurse S. Chen. He read it aloud to the assembled morning shift staff, each word punctuated with a meaningful pause that transformed the medical unit into a courtroom. Questioning physician orders. Unauthorized patient contact. Failure to respect chain of command. His eyes found hers across the gathered faces. I've notified administration. This will be part of your permanent file. He'd made sure everyone heard it. He'd made sure they knew she was marked, compromised, radioactive. By the time shift change hit, the nickname had already traveled through the unit like spilled blood, finding the lowest point: Little Miss Hero. 2 nurses said it within earshot. 1 resident. A tech who'd never even worked with her before. The words were designed to undercut her, to make her look like she was grandstanding, playing soldier, reaching beyond her role. They worked exactly as designed. At 2:04 a.m., the SEAL coded. The alarm came first, a screaming pitch that turned all heads toward Trauma Bay 3. The monitor showed hemorrhage, catastrophic, a bleed that shouldn't have happened, a drain that had disconnected somewhere inside him where no surgeon could immediately reach. His pressure dropped from 110 to 94 to 72 in the space of 90 seconds. Hargrove appeared at the room's entrance, already moving, already calling orders, his voice cutting through the code alert with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Get me 2 units O negative. Now. Call blood bank, I need type O positive. But the next voice that answered wasn't the blood bank tech. It was Sarah, already at the bedside, already assessing what everyone else was seeing. O negative is exhausted. The closest match is at UC San Diego, 40 minutes minimum transport time. She was already moving toward the supply cart, already calculating, and without conscious thought her hands found the tourniquet, the needle, the collection bags. I'm the same type as the patient. A positive. I can donate now. Hargrove's jaw went so tight it looked like it might fracture. He needed her blood. He needed this patient to survive because 3 Navy officers were somewhere in the hospital, probably in the waiting room, probably tracking every decision, every outcome. But accepting help from the nurse he'd systematically destroyed, the one he'd just humiliated in front of the patient's command staff, the one he'd posted on the unit board like a warning label, that burned like acid through his professional carefully constructed image. He gave a curt nod, nothing more, and Sarah was already lying on the stretcher position beside the SEAL's bed, her right arm extended on the donation armrest. The needle went in smooth. She didn't flinch. The phlebotomist, a tech named Rodriguez who'd watched the entire unit drama unfold, looked at her with something like recognition but said nothing. Blood flowed through clear tubing into collection bags, dark red and steady, the gravity-fed system pulling from her vein into the 4 lines that led to the SEAL's circulation. Hargrove stood with his arms crossed over his chest, watching the monitors instead of looking at her, watching the pressure numbers climb back toward viable ranges. 98, 104. 109, the heart rate dropped from 144 to 128. Sinus rhythm held. When the first unit transferred into the patient, the change was visible, color returning to pale lips, O2 saturation climbing, the body remembering how to function with fuel. Sarah donated the second unit without breaking her breathing rhythm, her chest rising and falling with the measured discipline of someone trained for blood loss, for shock, for the moment when the body tries to convince the mind that it needs to shut down. When it finished and the bandage was taped over the needle site, Hargrove walked out without a word. Not thank you. Not acknowledgement. Just the absence of his presence, which was somehow more damaging than anything he could have said. The SEAL's commander was standing in the doorway when Sarah sat up, and for just a moment their eyes met. His expression was unreadable, but something in that moment changed. Something shifted in the space between them, the way air pressure changes before a storm. She pressed her hand to the bandage on her arm, feeling the throb of the donation site, and made a mental note to drink more water, more salt, more of the things that rebuild blood volume. Standard protocol. What the body needed. Muscle memory. By morning, 6:27 a.m., when Sarah stood at her locker during the tail end of night shift, she overheard 2 residents at the nursing station, their voices carrying in the way voices do when people think they're far enough away to not be heard. Did you see Chen's arms when she donated? Those aren't surgical scars. Those look like shrapnel. The other one shrugged, adjusting his stethoscope. Hargrove says she's a liability. Administration is watching her now. Sarah touched the object she always carried, the faded unit patch sewn deep inside her jacket lining, the one that said Reaper, Ramadi 2011 in stitching that had faded to almost nothing. She could feel the fabric softness through the lining material, could feel the weight of it against her ribs even though it was barely physical. Then she closed her locker door and kept walking, her step unchanged, her jaw set the same way it had been set in the room with the SEAL and the commander and the eyes that didn't blink. Mercy General had been a safe place once. A place to disappear. A place where nobody asked questions about where the scars came from or why a trauma nurse moved through a crisis with the precision of something that had been forged in worse fires than ICU emergencies. That was finished now. Hargrove had made sure of it. And in doing so, without knowing what he was doing, he had set something in motion that would end careers. But not hers. 3 days after Sarah's blood filled the transfusion bag, Lieutenant Morrison's breathing changed. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and predictable, but Sarah heard the shift in tone from across the ICU, a slight whistle at the end of each cycle that hadn't been there before. She was restocking the med cart on the orthopedic floor when she heard it through the monitor feed, that single note of distress that most nurses would dismiss as normal variation. She froze with a box of syringes in her hands. Not a tremor. Not fear. Just recognition. Muscle memory waking up. The pressure numbers on Morrison's bedside monitor began their descent at 2:14 p.m. Systolic dropping from 118 to 112 to 104. Not dramatic. Not yet. Sarah watched from the hallway outside the orthopedic wing, where Hargrove had exiled her that morning with a reassignment notice and a smile that could cut glass. The ortho floor was quiet, mostly post-op patients on their way to discharge, their crises resolved, their drama finished. Safe. Boring. Exactly where he'd placed her to keep her away from the real work. But the numbers kept falling. 98, 94, 88. Sarah moved. No permission. No hesitation. Just movement toward the cardiac unit, her badge still clipped to her scrubs though Hargrove had made it clear she had no authority there anymore. The hallway between orthopedics and cardiac care stretched like a runway, fluorescent lights casting everything in that hospital white that made time feel suspended, made everything look sterile and wrong. She walked it like she'd walked corridors in Ramadi, same pace, same purpose, same willingness to move toward the sound of danger instead of away from it. Hargrove was waiting at the threshold to Morrison's room. Not coincidence. He'd been watching the monitor too, had seen the pressure drop, had positioned himself like a goalkeeper between her and the patient. His face held the expression of a man defending territory that didn't belong to him. "You're off this case, Chen," he said before she could speak. His voice carried the careful precision of someone reading from a script he'd already rehearsed. "I'm reassigning you to the orthopedic floor effective immediately. That was the arrangement. You stay away from my ICU." Sarah's eyes moved past him to Morrison's monitor. The numbers told their story in real time. Systolic now 82. Heart rate climbing toward 140. The visual picture of a man whose heart was being squeezed inside his own chest by fluid that shouldn't be there. Cardiac tamponade. She'd seen it once in a training facility outside 29 Palms. She'd treated it twice in Ramadi, once in the rubble of what used to be a school, once in the back of a Humvee doing 60 miles per hour over terrain that wanted to kill them all. "Doctor, he needs a pericardiocentesis now," Sarah said. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't plead. Just stated the facts like a systems report. "We don't have time to wait for a cardiologist. The pressure's dropping. Look at his JVD. Muffled heart sounds. He's tamponading." Hargrove's jaw tightened. "You don't have the authority to make that determination. Your reassignment is effective now. Security will escort you to your new station." But before security arrived, before Hargrove could finish whatever call he was already reaching for, the monitor went haywire. The steady beep accelerated into a frenzy, then fragmented into the chaotic rhythm of a heart in crisis. The alarm screamed, that electronic shriek that turned every head on the unit, that brought the attending physician running from the break room with cold coffee still in his hand. Hargrove moved. He did move. Sarah would give him that much. But he moved like someone trying to remember choreography he'd learned 30 years ago. His hands reached for the crash cart, pulled back, reached again. He knew what cardiac tamponade was. He knew what needed to happen. But the knowing and the doing were separated by a canyon of hesitation, and in the space of those 3 seconds, then 5, then 7, Sarah was already past him. She prepped the site with her left hand, fourth intercostal space, left midclavicular line, the anatomy a blueprint she'd drawn inside her own muscle memory so many times it was muscle. The 18-gauge needle came from the crash cart like her fingers knew exactly where to find it, like her hands were reading a map only they could see. No conscious thought. This was what Ramadi had taught her, how to let her body do the work while her mind stayed clear and empty. Pain was information. Everything else was distraction. The needle went in. Fluid came out. Dark amber fluid, blood that had leaked into the pericardial space, that had been slowly strangling Morrison's heart. 40 milliliters of it, then 80, then 120. With each milliliter, the pressure came down. The monitor rhythm smoothed. The chaos resolved into something that resembled order again. Sarah's hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this in the dark with no light and no backup, just the weight of another human's life balanced between her ribs and the absolute certainty that hesitation meant death. She withdrew the needle. Morrison's systolic pressure stabilized at 94. Then climbed to 102. The heart rate fell from 138 back down to 106. Normal. Not good yet, but normal. Alive. Present. Still in the fight. Sarah stepped back from the bedside and for the first time, she looked at Hargrove's face. The color had drained from it. But not the kind of pale that comes from seeing a life saved. The kind of white that comes from watching your authority evaporate in real time, watching a woman you'd been trying to destroy save a patient with a procedure you couldn't perform, watching your entire institutional hierarchy collapse because someone else had the courage and competence to act when you froze. His hands were shaking. Not from relief. From rage. Sarah moved toward the door. She didn't run. Didn't hurry. Just the same measured pace she'd used to walk into that hallway, the same composure she'd cultivated over 18 years of hiding in plain sight. She'd saved Morrison twice now, once with her blood, once with her hands. What happened next was no longer her responsibility. It took Hargrove exactly 12 minutes to start making calls. Sarah knew this because she heard him through the wall of his office, which was adjacent to the orthopedic break room where she was sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she watched the minutes accumulate. His voice started low and controlled, then escalated through the phone with each person who picked up. Board members need to hear about this. Unsanctioned procedure. No authorization. Patient safety violation. I have witnesses. We're looking at gross insubordination and a complete disregard for chain of command. The coffee tasted like metal. Sarah drank it anyway. By 3:45 p.m., he'd made calls to 3 board members who owed him favors from years of golf weekends and hospital fundraisers. By 4:27 p.m., he'd escalated to administration, speaking to the chief nursing officer with a tone that mixed professional concern with barely concealed vendetta. By 5:12 p.m., he'd contacted the state nursing board directly, citing a rogue nurse operating outside her scope of practice in a life-threatening manner. Sarah could hear the echo of his words through the thin walls. Could hear the way he shaped the narrative, not as an emergency intervention that saved a patient's life, but as a deliberate violation by a nurse who'd repeatedly challenged his authority, who'd demonstrated a pattern of insubordination, who'd compromised patient safety by acting without oversight. The truth was technically true. She had performed the procedure without his authorization. She had acted outside her scope as a standard ICU nurse. She had put her hands on a patient without permission. But the context, the dying patient, the frozen cardiologist, the 3 seconds that would have been 3 minutes and then Morrison would have arrested, that context never made it into Hargrove's narrative. In his version of events, there was only violation. Only a dangerous nurse who needed to be contained. By 6:24 p.m., she'd received notice that her shift assignment was being reviewed pending investigation. By 6:16 p.m., she was being asked to meet with HR at 7:53 a.m. the following morning. The investigation into her credentials was being expedited. The state nursing board was sending an investigator to Mercy General within 48 hours. Sarah sat in the break room and watched the rain start outside the windows. It hammered the parking lot with the kind of intensity that made the asphalt look like it was being punished for something it couldn't control. She thought about Ramadi. About the school. About the Humvee. About the 3 sailors she'd carried through 2 miles of hostile territory because stopping meant death and moving meant the possibility of living. All of that was classified. All of it was sealed. All of it was supposed to have vanished the day she was told to disappear into civilian life and never surface. And now Hargrove was pulling at threads that connected to things she couldn't defend without saying the things she wasn't allowed to say. Dr. Hargrove's office door was closed, but the conversation could be heard through the wall, his voice pitched at that careful frequency reserved for powerful men calling other powerful men. He had the hospital board president's private line memorized. Marcus Chen had once referred his daughter's cardiac surgery to Hargrove, and surgical miracles created permanent debts. The phone rang twice. "Marcus. It's Richard Hargrove." His voice was oil over steel. "We have a patient safety crisis at Mercy General, and I need your board authority within the hour." A pause. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. A nursing staff member performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. Pericardiocentesis. On a Navy SEAL patient. Without orders. The liability exposure is catastrophic. Another pause, longer this time. Hargrove's jaw tightened. "No, we can't wait for standard review. The patient is still critical, and this nurse is actively a danger. She's already violated protocol once. She'll do it again because she doesn't understand chain of command." He listened, nodding as though Marcus could see him through the phone lines. "Thank you. I'll send documentation to your email within minutes." He hung up and immediately dialed the state nursing board. This call was different, colder, more procedural. A woman answered on the second ring. Her name was Catherine Voss, and she had reviewed 3 of Hargrove's previous complaints about nursing staff over the past 18 months. All 3 had resulted in investigations. 2 had resulted in suspensions. "Catherine, this is Dr. Richard Hargrove at Mercy General in San Diego. I'm filing a formal complaint regarding senior nurse Sarah Chen, badge number for 47821. The words came out measured and precise, each one a stone in a wall. "I have documented evidence of a pattern of insubordination, protocol violations, and today, this morning, an unauthorized invasive medical procedure performed without physician consent or notification." He was already pulling files from his desk drawer, files he'd been building since the moment Sarah had questioned his transfusion order. "I'm providing comprehensive documentation. Incident reports. Witness statements. A formal write-up posted on the ICU bulletin board. And today's violation is the most serious. I'm requesting an immediate investigation into her credentials and her fitness to practice." His voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who had never been told no by an institution. "Yes, I can email everything within 10 minutes. This needs to move fast, Catherine. She's a risk." What he didn't say was that Sarah Chen was a risk to him. That her calm competence in the face of his authority felt like a mirror held up to something he'd spent 23 years perfecting, the appearance of infallibility. He hung up and called his personal attorney, a man named Gregory Pierce who specialized in professional misconduct cases and owed Hargrove a 7-figure favor from a surgical consultation that had saved Pierce's firm a medical malpractice settlement. "Gregory, I need an outside investigator retained immediately. Hospital employee misconduct case. Nursing staff. I want someone discreet but thorough. Someone who can document a pattern of dangerous behavior and get me a report within 48 hours. Gregory asked only one question: where to send the bill. Hargrove gave him the hospital's administrative account number. By 3 a.m., before Sarah had even finished her shift, the wheels were already moving. The security guard who arrived at the main ICU entrance at 7:08 a.m. was the same one who had smiled at Sarah the week before, who had complimented her on her work ethic during night shift when the hallways were quiet and the broken people came through the doors. His smile was gone now. His eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. He was holding a cardboard box, the kind used for moving personal items, thin and already starting to soften at the seams from the humidity of San Diego's early morning. "Your badge has been deactivated," he said quietly, not looking at her. "You need to clear your locker. Now." Sarah moved through the ICU like a ghost, already translucent, already halfway gone. Her colleagues pretended not to see her. The respiratory therapist, Mike, the one person who had brought her coffee during the Morrison crisis and asked if she was okay, was suddenly very focused on a ventilator screen. The charge nurse turned away. A nursing assistant she'd trained dropped her eyes to her phone. She packed in silence. The cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from a paramedic who used to bring her lunch. The dying succulent, its last leaf turning brown despite her efforts, brought to the hospital on her first day of orientation 3 years ago by someone whose name she'd forgotten. The photo of her unit in Ramadi, 8 faces arranged on a rooftop with the city burning behind them. 6 of those faces belonged to men who weren't coming home. 1 belonged to a boy she'd carried through 2 miles of hostile fire, bleeding from his leg, his arm around her shoulder. 1 belonged to her. The security guard stood at a distance, respectful but present. The box was getting heavy. Not from weight but from what it contained, a life that wasn't actually hers, borrowed and now being returned. She could see Hargrove's office from where she stood. He was there, phone pressed to his ear, watching her through the window like a hunter observing a wounded animal limping away into the forest. He was already on to the next call, the next coordination, the next move in a game he'd already won. She didn't look back. The bus stop on 5th Avenue was empty at 2 a.m. except for the rain. Actual rain, the kind that came in sheets off the Pacific, not the desert rain she remembered from Ramadi. That rain came in rare, violent bursts that turned the dust into mud the color of dried blood. This rain was clean and cold and indifferent. The cardboard box was already going soft at the bottom, the craft paper darkening. She could feel the mug shifting inside, could imagine the handle breaking if the box gave way. She'd been in civilian life for 7 years. 7 years of disappearing into a night shift at a hospital where no one knew her name, where she could save lives in the dark and no one had to know that the hands pushing on a chest cavity belonged to someone the Pentagon had officially erased. 7 years of keeping her head down, her credentials generic, her past classified above top secret. 7 years of following orders to never surface, to never reveal, to accept that the men and women she'd served with would exist only in her memory and in a file somewhere in a building she was no longer allowed to acknowledge. The rain soaked through the cardboard. The photo began to blur, 8 faces becoming watercolor abstractions. The names came anyway: Morrison, bleeding from a convoy ambush. Reyes, hit by IED shrapnel. Holloway, shot twice and still firing to cover her extraction. Graves, dead before the helicopter landed. 2 more names she wouldn't say aloud because saying them made them more real, made the fact that she was the only one still breathing feel like a kind of theft. The succulent's last leaf finally let go, spinning down into the puddle at her feet. At 11 p.m. on day 7, in a room 3 floors above where the bus stop waited in the dark, Lieutenant Morrison's eyes opened. Not the confused, half-aware opening of sedation wearing off, but the sudden clarity of someone returning to consciousness. His hand moved first, searching for the bed rail, testing his mobility. His breathing changed, the ventilator still present but fighting him now, his lungs demanding air faster than the machine could deliver it. He was waking up, and the first thing his body remembered was survival. Sarah was cleaning out her locker one final time, the respiratory therapist Mike helping her because he was the only one who would, because he'd seen her pull Morrison back from the edge and that was worth more to him than whatever gossip had already started circulating about her unsanctioned procedures and the dangerous competence. She was explaining to him why she wasn't going to fight it, why she was going to accept the termination and move on, when the code button was hit on Morrison's monitor upstairs. She left the locker open. She left Mike holding a handful of her scrubs. She was moving before the announcement even finished, muscle memory and something deeper than training taking over, the knowledge that this patient, this man she'd saved twice already, needed her more than he needed permission. Morrison's room was controlled chaos. A resident she didn't recognize was trying to run the code. The attending wasn't there yet. 2 of Morrison's SEAL team members stood pressed against the wall, their presence making the small hospital room feel like it was underwater. The monitor showed what she already knew: his heart was failing, the surgically repaired pericardium filling with fluid again, pressure building around the organ itself. Cardiac tamponade doesn't wait for authorization. It kills you in minutes. She moved to the bedside. The resident turned to her with the expression of someone about to ask who she was, but her hands were already moving, already assessing, already knowing what needed to happen. She met Morrison's eyes for one split second, and saw recognition flicker there, not of her face, but of something deeper. Something that remembered being saved. Cardiac tamponade, she said quietly. Not to the resident. To Morrison. To the room. We're going to fix it. Her voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't a nurse asking permission anymore. It was someone who had done this before in conditions that would make this hospital room look like a surgical palace. You need to step back, the resident said, trying to reassert something he'd never had. Sarah was already gathering what she'd need. An 18-gauge needle. Antiseptic. The knowledge of where to go, how deep, what angle, scar tissue knows no mercy, and she'd learned this procedure in a building in Ramadi with no light and no backup and a man bleeding out on a concrete floor. Fifth intercostal space. Mid-axillary line, she said aloud, narrating for the machines and the room. Subxiphoid approach. Going in now. The needle went in. The fluid came out. Clear, viscous, the pressure releasing like air from a punctured lung. The heart monitor began its steady return, the line that had been chaotic flatness transforming back into something organized, something survivable. Sinus rhythm. 84 beats per minute. The resident was staring at her like she'd just performed a miracle. One of the SEAL team members looked like he'd just watched someone resurrect himself from the dead. Morrison's eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. And then Hargrove was there, standing in the doorway, his face transforming through shock to something colder and more calculating in the span of one heartbeat. That was an unauthorized procedure, he said quietly. Sarah was already moving to the monitor, checking the readouts, confirming the stabilization, doing the 10,000 small things that came after saving a life. Patient was coding. Cardiac tamponade. Needed immediate intervention. Which I would have ordered if called. There was no time to call. She said it matter-of-factly, moving through the post-procedure check with the same precision she'd used to save Morrison's life. The room felt very cold. The rain was starting to fall again outside, the same rain that would still be falling in 4 hours at a bus stop on Fifth Avenue. Hargrove didn't argue further. He didn't need to. He already had his phone in his hand, and the look on his face said he'd been waiting for this moment since the morning she'd questioned his transfusion order. She'd just given him exactly what he needed to destroy her. By the time she finished her shift and went down to her locker, the paperwork was already waiting. Morrison's eyes opened on day 7, and for the first time since the training accident, there was clarity in them. Consciousness. Recognition. The ventilator had come out that morning, his lungs strong enough now to breathe on their own, and the monitors sang their steady rhythm, the most beautiful sound a trauma surgeon could hear. Sarah was finishing her shift when she told herself she'd just walk past his room. One final check. The kind of check that wasn't in her job description anymore, but the kind a senior chief petty officer performs anyway because you don't stop looking after your own just because paperwork says you're supposed to. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her badge had been deactivated 8 hours after Hargrove's calls went through, security walking her out while he stood in his office window like a man who'd just won a war. But Sarah had kept her hospital volunteer badge, the one she'd applied for during her first week, thinking that someday she might want to help in ways that didn't require a license. Someday had arrived faster than expected. She stood in the doorway of Morrison's room, watching him breathe without mechanical assistance, watching the man whose blood type had matched hers by perfect chance look out the window at the California sun. Then his eyes moved. Found her face. And the shift in them was immediate, a sharp snapping into focus like a rifle scope locking onto target. His hand shot out, fingers gripping her wrist with the kind of strength that shouldn't have existed in someone 5 days post-procedure, and he pulled her closer, his voice still rough from intubation but absolutely unmistakable, Reaper. The call sign hung in the room like a ghost. Nobody had called her that in 14 years. Nobody was supposed to call her that ever again. Sarah's composure didn't crack, but her hand paused for exactly 1 heartbeat, the only tell she'd ever given. Morrison's eyes locked onto hers with the recognition of someone who'd seen her face in night vision goggles, who'd followed her call sign through 2 miles of hostile territory in Ramadi, who'd made it home because she decided that 5 downed sailors weren't acceptable casualties. Reaper, he whispered again, and this time it was a question and an answer and a prayer all at once. That was when Commander Rhodes stepped out from the corner where he'd been standing the entire time. 7 days he'd been standing watch, never leaving his man's bedside, watching the nurses move through Morrison's room with practiced precision. But Rhodes had seen something shift in Morrison's face when the female nurse appeared, something military men recognized. He'd stepped into the hallway and made a call. 20 minutes later, a naval intelligence officer arrived with a classified file thick enough to require both hands, and Rhodes asked to read it in the conference room with the door closed. The silence in that room lasted exactly 90 seconds. Sarah was walking toward the elevator when Commander Rhodes found her, and the way he moved, the precise control of someone who'd seen combat and carried authority, made every person in the hallway unconsciously create space. He was holding the file open to a page marked with his trembling fingers. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen," he said, his voice steady but his hands not, his eyes scanning over her face as if seeing her for the first time. "Navy Cross recipient. 2 silver stars. 3 Purple Heart citations. Operator designation, Reaper." He turned the page. Ramadi, 2009. Fallujah, 2010. Sanjin Valley, 2011. Another page. 5 men extracted from the Jolin District convoy ambush. 3 additional operators recovered during secondary sweep. His voice cracked on the last line. "Your commander's report says you carried Lieutenant Morrison personally through 2.5 miles of hostile fire after his convoy was hit. Your hands were burned from the exhaust manifold of the Humvee you used for cover." Sarah didn't respond. She'd learned years ago that silence in moments like this was more powerful than any explanation could be. The file in Rhodes' hands contained things she'd never spoken aloud, things that had been locked behind classified stamps and need-to-know restrictions so tight that even her own family believed she'd simply been a logistics officer with minor field exposure. The truth had lived in redacted documents that only people at commander level and above could access. Rhodes stepped into the hallway and spoke loudly enough that the nursing staff at the central station stopped moving. His voice carried the absolute authority of naval command, and every person in that corridor heard every word. "This is Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, U.S. Navy SEAL Team 3. Navy Cross recipient. She performed 2 emergency pericardiocenteses in this hospital, 1 authorized by Dr. Hargrove and 1 performed without his authorization, and saved the life of Navy SEAL Lieutenant Morrison both times. Her combat trauma training is specialized, her medical competence is exceptional, and her removal from this hospital on the grounds of alleged incompetence is hereby noted as officially reversed by Naval Medical Command." He paused, let the word settle into the silence. "The patient she saved is my man. And she's one of ours." Morrison's tattoo artist had done the work the year before he deployed, 6 inches up his forearm in black ink, the call sign that had haunted his dreams and saved his life written in military lettering, Reaper. He'd pulled up his sleeve an hour later when Sarah returned to his room to check his surgical site, and he'd pointed to the name on his skin with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious texts. "I got this after Ramadi," he said quietly. "Every time someone asked what it meant, I couldn't tell them. Still can't, technically. But you should know." He gripped her shoulder with his uninjured arm. "You should know that what you did, what you've been doing, it matters." It mattered. The naval intelligence officer, Captain Walsh, designated for declassification liaison, arrived at noon with a folder marked reclassified as OFO 600 hours and the kind of quiet authority that made Dr. Hargrove's instinctive power plays look like a child arguing over toys. Walsh found Sarah in the break room and sat down across from her without asking permission. "Your security clearance was reinstated this morning," he said simply. "Your service record is no longer classified. Your mission parameters in Ramadi have been officially reclassified under the War Crimes Documentation Initiative, which means they're part of the public record now if you want them to be." He slid a folder across the table. "Command wants to know if you'd consider transitioning to a consultant role once this hospital situation is resolved." Sarah opened the folder. 14 years of her life lay inside it in 23 pages of official documentation. Names of the 5 operators she'd pulled out of Ramadi. The citation for her Navy Cross. The formal documentation of the Jolin District convoy ambush. Everything she'd been told to forget. Everything she'd locked away so carefully that sometimes she'd believed her own cover story: logistics officer, minor field exposure, nothing significant. By the time Hargrove realized what was happening, it was already too late. Commander Rhodes appeared at his office door at 1847 hours with security in the hallway behind him and cardboard box in his hand. The same box that had held Sarah's cracked mug and dying succulent and photographs from a life that wasn't supposed to exist. Hargrove's jaw tightened as Rhodes set the box on his desk with deliberate care, and when Rhodes spoke, his voice was the kind of quiet that makes men's spines go rigid. "Dr. Hargrove, I believe you know the way out. The hospital board accepted your resignation this morning. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the kind of finality that comes from someone who spent 20 years making decisions that got people killed or saved them based on seconds of judgment." Hargrove tried to speak. Tried to invoke protocol, hierarchy, the rules that had protected him for so long. But Rhodes had already turned to leave, and the security guard, the same one who'd walked Sarah out 3 days ago, was already moving toward him with something like satisfaction in his expression. 6 months later, Sarah ran the emergency department at Mercy General. Her office overlooked the trauma bay where she'd saved Morrison twice, where she now trained residents in the kind of field medicine that most of them would never need, and some of them would carry with them into the military or private medical response, or simply into the knowledge that sometimes the textbook answers weren't the ones that saved lives. Morrison was back to full duty, the scar from her pericardiocentesis a thin white line on his chest that he showed off like a medal. He came by the hospital on Fridays with rotating members of his team, and the respect they showed her, the way they moved aside when she entered a room, the way they called him without a hint of sarcasm, sent a message to every single person in that emergency department: this woman had authority that no hospital badge could grant. On her desk sat 2 photographs. The first was from Ramadi, faded, worn, the faces of 6 operators barely recognizable in the night vision green glow. 3 of them had come home. 3 of them hadn't. The second photograph was newer, taken 3 months ago at her promotion ceremony: Sarah in navy dress blues, Morrison in his dress uniform with his arm around her shoulder, the entire SEAL Team 3 Charlie platoon in formation behind them, their expressions serious with the kind of pride that comes from knowing what someone had sacrificed to get them home. Next to the photograph sat the succulent, thriving now in the California sun. She'd learned to water it properly, learned that even the most dying things could come back to life with the right attention and the right amount of care. The respiratory therapist who'd stayed her friend, one of the few staff members Hargrove's isolation campaign hadn't broken, brought coffee and gossip one afternoon. Hargrove tried to apply to 3 hospitals in the county. All rejected within the hour. She paused at the door. His teaching CPR certification at San Diego Community College now. $18 an hour. His medical license is still active, but nobody will hire him. Sarah nodded, not smiling, just acknowledging. The lesson had been delivered. The hierarchy had been recalibrated. And somewhere in the database of every hospital administrator in Southern California, Dr. Hargrove's name was flagged with a single notation that his former colleagues understood perfectly: do not hire. Ever. That afternoon, Morrison stopped by with 3 other operators from his team, and they placed Navy SEAL Challenge coins on her desk, the kind that only went to people who'd been under fire with them, who'd made decisions that meant the difference between coming home and not coming home. "There are 12 more of us," Morrison said quietly. 12 operators who made it home because you were there. Your name is in 3 tattoos I know of personally. Probably more that I don't. Captain Walsh appeared behind them, still in uniform, carrying new orders. "Naval Medical Command wants to consult with you on combat trauma protocols," he said. "You'd be part-time. Based here. Teaching the next generation what the textbooks can't cover." He paused. "The ones you're comfortable sharing, anyway." Sarah looked at her office, at the emergency department she'd rebuilt, at the team she'd trained to think faster and trust their instincts. Then she looked at the photograph from Ramadi, at the faces of the ones who hadn't made it home. "I'll do it," she said. "Someone has to teach them what works when the textbooks don't matter anymore." That evening, she wrote one line in the department newsletter, a message for every nurse who'd ever been dismissed or diminished. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've made it this far, you know what happens when someone underestimates the quiet person in the room. Subscribe for more stories about heroes who don't wear capes. Like this video if you believe in them, and comment below, would you have walked away, or would you have saved him too?